We're on. Hey, welcome back, everybody. My name is Scott Kress, and welcome to the Extreme Leadership Podcast, where we explore topics of leadership and team building through the lens of high mountain and polar expeditions. Today, I am excited to talk with Denise Martin, one of the most experienced polar adventurers and guides today. Denise has been instructing and guiding for over 30 years. Sorry about that, Denise. Mine's over 30 years as well. Denise is one of the original polar guides, and she led the first commercial and the first all-women's expedition to the geographic North Pole in 1997. She's also guided many Antarctic, Greenland, Norway, and Canadian polar expeditions, and even spent time in the Australian outback as a camel expeditioner. Denise and I first met back in the 90s when we were both working at the Canadian Outbound Wilderness School. And I hadn't seen Denise for a long time. And then I was standing in line at the Punta Arenas airport, getting ready to fly to Antarctica. And I heard this voice behind me that sounded familiar. And I turned around to see who it was. And there was Denise standing there. So it was great to reconnect with Denise. She was on her way to Antarctica as well to guide a South Pole expedition. So it's great to have her with us here today. She's now living in Scotland and running polar training courses in Norway and has other things on the go as well. So Denise has done some pretty amazing things. It's given her some unique insights into leadership and teams. I'm super grateful that Denise has spent some time, built some time into her schedule to be with us today. So welcome, Denise.
Hey, thanks for having me, Scott. Great to reconnect as well.
So I've told people a little bit about you, but let's get to know Denise a little bit more. So before we get into these topics of leadership and team building, let's learn a little bit more about you. What are the few women in a predominantly male field? There's guiding field, and specifically in the polar fields here. So tell us a bit about your background, how you got started leading wilderness and polar expeditions.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's just not very many females at all in the polar world whatsoever, and doing kind of extreme guiding that I was. I just happened to be in it because I love winter, and I love working with dogs, and I love the winter environment. And I think I just kept following my heartstrings, just to say, just keep pushing out and doing all these different expeditions and expedition and trips and taking opportunities as they came. And it just was sort of luck. And I suppose it was a bit of insight in my part to know that if I didn't win one trip, it would lead to the next trip. And if I got involved with these people, I could perhaps get connected in that way. So it just all flowed for me, to be honest. And I think it's just my love for winter that really kept me in the polar world.
Yeah. So you're originally from Canada, now living in Scotland, but you were just back in Canada this summer. You came over with your twins, boy and girl, 14, is that right?
No, the 16 turning 17.
16 turning 17.
Learning to drive, and last year of school and off to university soon. It's
exciting.
A big thing. Yeah, so I'm actually, I grew up in Regina, so I'm a prairie girl, and definitely a prairie girl at heart. I totally love Saskatchewan. And Canada is still my home. I mean, I've lived in Scotland for, I guess just 16 years now, because I came over when I was pregnant with Robert and Kirsten. And Scotland's a lovely place, and I'm really fortunate to have had time here. But my heart certainly is still back in Canada. And every summer I go over, take the kids back and spend time in Saskatchewan with my family and up at our cabins up in northern Saskatchewan.
Yeah. And are either of your kids interested in polar travel, polar expeditions?
Well, you'll love this. Robbie, or Robert, as he likes to be known now that he's older, is really into climbing now. So he's got the bug of rock climbing, and he's done a couple of courses. He came back from spending 2 weeks in Canada helping us re-roof our cabin, and he decided to walk the West Highland Way, which is a route from Glasgow up to Fort William, going through Glen Cove. So it's a pretty significant walk. Well, he decided to do it solo, and took himself out there for 6 days and had a really big experience and then loved it. And now he's planning his next hiking trip. So I'd say that's more his thing. He loves being out in the bush and being up in the lake in northern Saskatchewan. And Kirsten, she's just likes doing anything adventurous and anything that has to do with travel. So she was part of a fundraising trip that ran from Paris to St. Andrews over a week in a relay. So that was a really big deal. So Yeah, she's quite the adventurer, I would say, and it'd be interesting to see what she ends up doing and if she settles down.
Yeah, nice. So you yourself, you've traveled around the world. Do you have a favorite expedition from the past or a favorite region that you like to go to?
It's probably like you, all places just have really special things about them, whether it's the people that you were with and the silly things that you did. We're talking about that Lakehead trip up in north of Thunder Bay, and it was just, crazy -40 and dogs were being mad. And so those sorts of things are really important. I do love Antarctica. I mean, you know what it's like. It just gets under your skin, and it's that big open vastness that I think reminds me of my home in the prairies. And I do love Antarctica. I'm very fond of big, long canoe trips. There's nothing sort of more special than traveling across the water and having a journey and exploring. So I suppose I'd say besides northern Saskatchewan, probably Antarctica is my favorite place to
Yeah,
journey.
I think like me, right? Different places for different reasons. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So you spend some time in Norway as well, doing some polar training. So tell us a bit about your polar training company, and then also I don't know if you're in a position to talk a little bit about your book that you're talking about putting together.
Oh, the book, have you put a book together? You've written a book, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
Yes, and like, I mean, as soon as you put the idea out, it's like people have heard about it. Now I need to actually get my butt in gear and get it happening. So the book idea is just, I mean, like you, this sort of thing. It's like you meet so many amazing people along the way in this kind of work, whether they're guides or leaders or people that you're just traveling with. I mean, there's so many amazing stories out there. And in terms of sort of women in extreme expeditions and leadership, there are not a lot of books that feature people that you just don't hear about. So I think it's always really interesting to find the people that aren't, showcased, and the people that aren't the big wigs and doing the big trips and getting all the recognition. There's a lot of people doing some really interesting work with other people and leading in different ways. So that's what the book's going to be about when I get it together. The polar training, I kind of have always been into it, even up in the Arctic. When I worked with Northwinds up out of Iqaluit, we always had people. I thought it was a crazy idea. Who would want to pay money to get trained to go do a South Pole trip? I mean, who in the right mind would want to do that? Well, it happens to be a very popular business model and very successful for the companies that are doing it. There's a lot of people who want to explore these extreme places, and I suppose rightly so, want to be prepped and feel skilled to do it. So the Norway training out of Finse it's a great location. It's where Amundsen and pretty much anybody who wants to train for polar trips goes. Ironically, it's a mountain environment. And so I don't know, have you been there, Scott? I can't
I have
remember.
not.
No, so it's
One of the spots I have not made yet.
yeah, well, you will get there, but doesn't really mimic being in Antarctica. It's kind of a bit more mountainous. And I suppose if you were prepping for a Greenland trip, which is very um, well, you get everything. You get the coastal, you get the extreme plateaus, but at any rate, Finse is a great location because it has a great vibe, and there's always really interesting people there, and it's a great place to just take anybody, whether they're new to the polar world or new to winter camping, or those who are extremely skilled and want to really push the limits. It's a great place to go.
Yeah, and as you know, right, this outdoor adventure field over the last 20 years has really exploded in popularity, and more people, since I've been going to Antarctica over the last 12 years or so, whatever it is, it just every year more and more people, and not everybody is prepared, as you and I have both experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's really great for those people who are wise enough to engage in the training before you hop into these pretty extreme environments. So if somebody wanted to find out about your training, do you have a website, or how would they find you?
Well, I think just looking at polar training in Norway, my website's not up quite yet, but there's a really good one called Polar Expedition Training, which is Hannah McKeon, who I know you know really well. She runs an awesome show, and Shackleton does some as well, and Ausland Expeditions. I mean, there's a whole range of different opportunities for people and offering different types of trainings. And I think it's important for anybody who's looking into it to just go with the right people who have the right
Yeah.
thing for you. What are you looking at? Something's happening over there.
Oh no, I'm good. I'm just trying to look up refresh a name for myself here. But
Okay.
yeah, and we know, Hannah was on the podcast a few weeks ago.
Excellent.
And then this is where I'm blanking right now.
Well, so the original polar trainers was Maddie and Paul.
Yeah.
So we know, obviously, they were running the Outward Bound school. So they started the first ones up in Baffin Island with Northwinds, and that was in the 90s. And you're thinking that was pretty insightful of them, wasn't it, to get that happening?
Yeah, way ahead of the times.
But you know, it's fascinating. Just your point about the expedition world changing. A lot of the companies that are operating now and that is successfully operated are ex-Outward Bound people, whether that's in the States or across the world or in Canada. And so that whole platform of Outward Bound schools really ignited a group of people like ourselves to make a living out of something that we love doing. So isn't that a great thing?
Yeah. As I run into, more and more people there, we often have that Outward Bound background in common, which is always great. And we'll talk about that next. I think that's a great segue into, now let's get specifically into talking a little bit more about leadership and team building. So, you and I both have this foundation of coming out of Outward Bound. And I think for me and for most people who were either a student at Outward Bound or an instructor at Outward Bound, it was a very formative time for many of us. So how do you think that Outward Bound contributed to your development as an expedition leader?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I started when I was 18. I went and did a 2-day rock climbing course in Karameus at the Outward Bound Mountain School. And I just had this light bulb moment where I thought to myself, if I could make a living out of doing this, I'll just be the happiest person in the world. And so I just followed that path. I mean, I started working at Outward Bound in the kitchen. I was doing dishes. I was cooking. I graduated to looking after the equipment, and then eventually got myself over to the Wilderness School in Ontario, which is really where I fell in love with sort of the Outward Bound concept. I think it was because of the people that were running the program there, and were so ahead of their time with their values and the educational elements of Outward Bound. So I think it really, for me, it wasn't so much about, I mean, I started doing it because I just like being outdoors. I mean, I was one of those kids in school that was always looking out the window, and I just couldn't wait to get out and doing things. And I think I learned pretty quickly, maybe not as quickly as I should have at Outward Bound, that it was really more about the people that you're working with. And it was just about their own personal development, and realizing that everybody coming in just had a different reason for being there. It wasn't like they needed some hardcore expedition. Half the time, it really was about reconnecting with nature, learning skills, and gaining confidence in themselves, and sort of this whole resilience, and being able to then step into their lives, whether it was back in Toronto or in London or wherever, just to be rejuvenated and I think really just feeling good about themselves. So those lessons have kind of always stayed with me, and I have to remind myself of that because I get a bit carried away with some crazy trips, and I love doing extreme things and dog sledding off of waterfalls and stuff, but it's not really about that, is it? It's just about seeing people blossom in an incredible environment, I think.
Yeah. And I think, that was the big part of, what you got a lot out of as an instructor at Outward Bound is to see other people use the wilderness or have this wilderness experience to really grow as an individual. And many people came into the course and left the course as different people, different way of seeing the world, and a different, kind of really helping to understand their personal values and who they wanted to be, how they wanted to travel, and so on. So what do you think makes a great leader in an extreme expedition environment then? What are the characteristics?
If you'd asked me this about 20 years ago, I would have had a very different response. I probably would have said, tough and able to deal with hard situations. And what else we would have said? I would have thought, always having really good hard skills, and being able to be skilled in that. Those are really important. And I still believe those are important. But I'd say now, having been in it for a while and kind of constantly always relearning, I think patience and being able to um, be a learner in the situation and understanding where people are coming from and what they need. And so listening, good communication, being patient, empathy, if that's, if that's a thing there. I think a leader is somebody who needs to be in the background more and give the people a baseline of skills and a development of their confidence to go and try it for themselves. Because I think experiential education, which the merits of Outward Bound is the way that a person really develops their skills. And so I think I also feel that a real good a leader, a proper leader, is somebody who's just themselves and is authentic and isn't trying to be some big person that needs to take all the attention. I think if anything, they need to be somebody who feels really happy with being able to step in the background because they've been able to give over enough information and enough skill development so that the people that they're with can just take over and do it on their own. I mean, is that how you feel about it? What do you think?
Well, in our training courses, we talk a lot about servant leadership. And that's, what you're talking about is really about servant leadership. It's about being there to serve people. If the experience is about helping them to achieve, it's not about you looking, flashy and famous yourself, but it's about helping other people to achieve and to learn and to grow. Again, I think a big part comes out of, both of our Outward Bound backgrounds, because that's really what Outward Bound is all about. And then, a lot of what you're talking about as well fits into the emotional intelligence category. You can be the greatest climber or polar adventurer and have solid hard skills, but if you don't have those emotional intelligence soft skills, you might be able to climb the tallest mountain and ski across Antarctica, but you're not going to be able to be as an effective a leader without those emotional intelligence elements really coming into play. So, really important. Now, we've mentioned and talked about North Pole several times, and, just kind of an aside note here, because a lot of people don't really understand the difference between the magnetic North Pole and the geographic North Pole. So I know you're not a geographer, but you have been to these areas. You know what it's all about. Can you just explain to people a little bit about what's the difference between magnetic and geographic North Poles?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I actually brought a little prompt.
Nice. Perfect.
Yeah, so this is a delicious orange that I've drawn all over, and the top of the orange is where the North Geographic Pole is, and the bottom of the orange is the South Geographic Pole. So the geographic pole is where these lines of longitude all converge. It's at the very top of the Earth, and the South Pole's the geographic South Pole's at the very bottom of the Earth. So where all those lines of longitude converge, it's a fixed point, and you could actually, the funny thing is it's a fixed point, but it's actually on the Arctic Ocean. So it's sort of a floating fixed point. But if you could just imagine this is a hard shell. So the geographic North Pole is there. So it's right at the very top. And the magnetic North Pole is where your compass needle points to. Because it's influenced by all of the magnetic fields within the Earth's core. And the reason the magnetic North Pole moves around is because those fields inside the Earth's core change. But the geographic North Pole and South Pole do not change. So if you're out in the hills with somebody and they say, what's the declination? You're thinking to yourself, okay, the declination is the difference between the magnetic North Pole, which let's pretend it's here, and the geographic North Pole. So depending on where you are on the Earth, that declination is going to change. So is that a very good explanation?
Yeah, because you're the needle on your compass points to magnetic, even if geographic is over here.
Yes.
So your declination is the difference between those 2 points and how you can tell true north versus magnetic north.
Yeah.
And that makes it a little bit more complex, because what a lot of people don't know is that the magnetic North Pole is actually south of the geographic North Pole. And when you go above that region, navigation with a compass becomes a little bit more complex.
Yeah, it really does get a bit wonky, really, when we were skiing to the North Pole. And it's interesting, too, because some people say, oh, you know, I did a North Pole expedition. And you're like, okay, well, did you do a full North Pole geographic expedition from Canada or Russia? Or did you do a last degree? Did you fly in? Did you do the magnetic North Pole? Like, what North Pole did you go to? Because, you know, I suppose part of my, you know, I do have a mini bit of an ego, I'd say, and I do like to differentiate the fact that I did ski to the North Geographic Pole from the top of Canada, and that was a very long expedition and a very hard one, and for sure. And so the magnetic compass did get a bit wonky. And if can I just talk about that trip for a minute?
Well, yeah, because that was actually
right?
the next thing I was going to ask you to tell us a bit about that, because that was a pretty groundbreaking expedition in many different ways. You know, first commercial expedition, you know, because up until that point, it had always been kind of these professional adventurers who had gone, and also first all women's expedition. So
yeah, and the concept was amazing, and my hat goes off to the woman Carolyn Hamilton who pulled the whole idea together. I mean, and she thought, well, let's just get a bunch of ordinary women to ski to the North Pole. I mean, if you said that today, you probably wouldn't do it, because it's such an incredibly dangerous place to travel now, in particular because of global warming and the melting of the ice cap. It's a very, I mean, basically you're kayaking there most of the time, or rafting, aren't you? But our trip, it's hard to know where to begin with this. You know, I was 30 years old. I was was I fresh? I'd been doing a lot of things still, but when I think back to it, to be invited to co-guide that trip, and as a 30-year-old, I mean, that was really lucky. And that was Maddie McNair, who, you know, she was a huge mentor of mine and a very outdoor person, and, you know, doing stuff that people probably still wouldn't dream of doing. So I was very fortunate to get asked to guide that with her. And, you know, I knew it was going to be a hard trip, and I knew the environment was going to be all on the Arctic Ocean. But I sure the heck didn't know it was going to be -50 when we landed on March 14th. And I certainly didn't know that the first 50 miles were going to be massive rumbles of sea ice that are very difficult to travel over. I mean, we were basically slogging over those things in our boots and moving sleds, you know, with 5 people. And so it was incredibly eye-opening for me. But I just thrived in the environment. I loved it, because that was when I was really young and really fit and really tough, right? That's what I thought a leader was supposed to be about. Well, I pretty quickly learned that it was really just about doing things together and being able to not really survive, do better than survive, to actually thrive in an environment that really just wanted to spit you out, because it's not the kind of place that people should be traveling in. Let's be honest. You know, if you're a polar bear and you're skilled in that, it's great. But as humans pulling sleds on skis, it's just a bit of a silly idea, really. Let's be honest. Yeah. So, I mean, I could waffle on for ages about the trip, but it was, you know, it was 81 days of not showering. It was 5 different teams, because it was done as a relay. Jeff Summers, who's, you know, the god of polar travel, as far as I'm concerned, did the training of those women before they got flown out to us on the ice. And it was a real team effort, for sure. But it was really, really emotionally draining, in that we had 5 different relay teams come in, and it felt like I was married and divorced 5 times, because every time a new team would come out, you know, you might be up at 87 degrees and the sea ice might be flowing around, and there might be tons of open water, and people really needed to have their act together, because it's a really dangerous situation. And you get these newbies come out, and you're just like, oh, isn't this great? Let's film this. And you're like, no, actually, this is really serious stuff. And so really quickly needing to establish some good ground rules, but get people up to speed with safety and some real basic skills. And I have to say, it was Jeff Summers who trained them all up in Resolute Bay that really, you know, it was like Jeff's boot camp, really. And so they came out to Maddie and I in really good form. And there was, you know, some serious incidents. There was one where I was swimming and really shouldn't have probably made it. But yeah, I think it was just about learning about how to be with people in a very extreme environment and really having to have my act together as one of the leaders, and also be humble at the same time, because Sedna, the sea goddess, she was really ready to swallow us up at any time, really.
Yeah. So, most people, they came and went through that trip, but you were there from start to finish. So what was it like to take those steps, probably briefly onto the North Pole before you floated away? And then what was it like to be with the people who were with you at that time when you made it to that point?
Well, they have interesting questions, and I'm not going to try to. I'll answer this very honestly. So I got there on my birthday. So isn't that amazing? May 26th, turned 31. It's like, how did I ever end up at the North Pole on my birthday? So that was really special.
Yeah.
There were some incredibly crazy dynamics happening with the leadership in the team. And earlier on the expedition, I quickly realized that my role was to make sure everyone was safe and that everyone was feeling good about themselves, and that I was in the background keeping things sort of together in a real quiet way. There was a bit of leadership struggling going on. So when we got to the North Pole, it was an amazing feeling, but it was also very disappointing, because Maddie and I, who had led the trip, we were basically asked to just move aside, and people wanted to get their photos taken without us. So the whole, you don't do these trips for recognition, but you actually want to do it as part of a team. And so to get there, and the team was the two of us, I mean, that was pretty special, and we still will feel that way.
Yeah.
But it was disappointing in that it didn't feel like a huge, big team effort, because there was a massive team behind, even back in Resolute and in Britain. So that was my first, I'd say, experience with this whole, like, what's the word I'm looking for? People needing the guides to move aside. You know that feeling, don't you?
Yeah. Well, I think, maybe even more accentuated for you on that trip because of the rotation of the people. You didn't spend the whole trip with the same group of people. But yes, it is strange. And yes, you get to the top of a mountain or to a geographic location, and people are like, okay, can you just move out of the way? I want to get my picture here. You're like, okay. So, it's not about me, right? And it's not about my ego or recognition, but I was part of it too.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a funny thing. I would never do that to somebody, I think, is what you and I would be like, everybody together, let's group hug. We've done this together. It was so foreign to me.
Yes.
And you don't see it all the time. But when you see it, it just makes my stomach turn a little bit, because I think of all the hard work goes into encouraging people, and you sort of feel like, oh, was that all lost? It's a bit like you sort of a parent, and suddenly your children decide that they don't want you anymore. And that's my feeling now, actually, as my kids are turning 17. But yeah, so North Pole trip.
What they're supposed to do.
That's what they're supposed to do. Yes, you're right. They're not supposed to. Yeah, that's true. But anyway, it was an amazing trip, and I've had some incredible expeditions in different places.
You mentioned Jeff a few times, kind of training people, getting people ready for this expedition. And yourself, Maddie, leaders here. You've mentioned a few other people, kind of leaders in polar environments. So can you think about a great leader from polar history, or it could even be current polar environment, that you feel this person's a great leader, and why do you think they're a great leader? And yeah, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I did. Well, like when you sent me the questions or some of the things we might talk about, I thought a lot about that, because over the years I've never engaged in reading about polar history. I'm not an avid reader. I would rather be out walking my dogs or going for a run. And so polar history it's not a huge love of mine. And I'm sure there's a lot of incredible people doing amazing things. I think the few people that stick in my mind, and they're like on sort of two very different things. One is a woman that we both worked with at Outward Bound, if you remember, Lynn Plinsky. Now, she was a Lakehead graduate as well. But so I mention her because she's just this amazing, accomplished skier, and she's chosen to an outdoor person, and just incredibly gifted in so many things. And she's spent most of her professional career noting all of the Inuit communities and their place names, and she's mapped that out all through the north. But on top of that, she basically has started a soup kitchen in Iqaluit, and so she's over the 15, 20 years she's lived up there, she's fed so many families, and I think she's really enriched people's lives. So I think for me, she represents a person who actually is a leader in a community. She's just actually doing things. So she's a super cool lady, Lynn. And she used to scare the pants off of me when we worked together at Outward Bound, because she was just so awesome. He was just like, wow, goddess sort of. So the other trip that I think is incredible, and it will never, ever, there's nothing that will ever be the same, is that International Trans-Antarctic Expedition that Will Steger and Jean-Louis Etienne put together. So that was with Jeff Summers as the dog musher. And I mean, I cannot even imagine how they prepped for that trip. Was that in 88? I can't remember what year that trip was. It was about that. It was when dogs were still allowed in the Antarctic. 7 months. They crossed all of Antarctica using a sextant. I mean, they didn't even have like iridium phones, and GPSs were basically kind of used, but not the so modern word. So how they even got the logistics and kept themselves together on that expedition, I think is phenomenal. So Jeff Summers to me is my hero. He always will be. He's just a gentleman. He's incredibly skilled, and he never says anything bad about anybody. He's amazingly humble, and he's just a terrific, I would say just a terrific sort of person to sort of emulate, in that he's just so honestly himself and just not a big deal. He's just amazing guy. You should get him on one of these podcasts. He's a phenomenal guy.
Let's look at making that happen.
Yeah. I was going to actually, just to backtrack though, I was going to say on our North Pole trip in 97, I think the other thing that was exceptional, besides all the people that were involved, is that we had a small GPS, but we had no iridium phones, and our only contact to the outside world was with an HF radio. So I was the radio operator, and I just loved that job.
Which probably didn't work very well.
No, and it was amazing. So it's incredible what the things that people did in those early explorations with so few sort of vices that are out there now. And I think the whole development of communications and navigation is a real positive, and it keeps people safe. But there's also an argument that it's really changed our exploration, hasn't it?
Yeah, we could spend a whole podcast just talking about the double-edged sword of communications and being in touch. And I remember my early expeditions going into the mountains and basically just disappearing off the map for 30, 40 days and then coming out again, and there's no interaction with the outside world, and we're just so connected with people. As much as you try to turn it off, it's hard to do so. You've experienced it, I've experienced it. You're in Antarctica and people are texting you, and it's like, well, I don't really want to be dealing with this right now.
No, it's just it's not really there. I mean, that's when sort of real skills are needed in those early years of exploration. You just need to be confident and know that you had the skills to get yourself out of situations, and you would make decisions based on the skills that you had. So decision making was also very, very different, perhaps less risky or more risky, but it was just a very different dynamic for us as leaders, wasn't it? Yeah.
And so, it's coming back to, talking about Jeff and leadership, and it sounds like, a lot of things that you're, sharing that really add up to a great leader, visionary, seeing things and trying things that maybe have never been done before, but then being very humble about that, and it's about bringing the team, encompassing the team in there. And then like emotional intelligence has been a topic we've talked about a bunch in here as well, that really ties into that. So as a leader, your job really is a team builder in many cases, unless you're solo. If you're going on a solo expedition, well, deal with yourself. But
exactly.
Most of the time, we got a team. So you have to, and you would have experienced this in the North Pole trip, having multiple times where you have to build a team almost overnight. As you said, these people get dropped off, and all of a sudden they're in this extreme environment, and you have to be working together quickly. So how would you, we've talked about leadership, but how would you define a high performance team? If somebody said, tell me, what is a great team? How would you describe that?
Well, I think a high performance team is a team that has a common goal, that can identify issues quickly if there's issues, and problem solve and act on solving those problems. So it's a uniform team that can come together quickly and make decisions with everybody's input and investment. But I think it's about problem solving and finding solutions. And I also think, you're trying to get people, whatever environment it is, it's all about the learning blocks. It's getting the base skills right. So it's the devil's in the detail. You need to set, a good example, people need to learn how to set up tents properly. If they don't learn that basics, then it all goes to hell throughout the trip. The tents are going here and the wind's blowing there. And so you've got to learn the getting the little things correct first gets the team on the right direction. So, when you're skiing to the South Pole, excuse me, you want everybody to be out of the tent at the same time, at the right time, at the same time, to be ready so that there aren't people, still needing to go to the loo when everyone else is still ready with their pulk. So you need to have those proper things in place for things to flow. And I think once you get those details correct, then the real sort of, it just builds, doesn't it? Then you can go into the next step of, then people are navigating. Okay, so let's learn some basic navigating. Oh, you've got that mastered. Excellent. Now let's learn about da-da-da, and you just keep building it. So I think as a leader, you need to understand those steps, and you need to be confident in delivering and instructing with those basic things, and then let people try and get on with it, and then they become the ones that are doing it. So I'm not sure I answered your question properly.
But no. It's a very collaborative, what you see as being a high performance team is a collaborative environment where everybody they have the skills, they work together to support one another to accomplish the task at hand, and, as you mentioned, having that routine in place, that everybody is out of the tents at the same time. Everybody's ready to ski at the same time, so people aren't getting overly cold. My most recent South Pole trip this past January, and we created a really great team. We had a team of, was there 8 or 10 people? I can't remember exactly now, but a big group of people, bigger than most South Pole expeditions. And when you stop for the day, it's cold, it's windy, people are tired, they're hungry. You need to get your tents up fast and get inside. But there's a lot of tasks that need to happen. And so each tent group is their own mini team, but then we're all one team. So people would work really efficiently to get their own tents up. But then before they dive into their personal tent, they would go and help somebody else. If somebody else is moving a little bit slower or whatever, go and help them out. And once all of the tents were set up, then we're ready to move in. So it is this very collaborative, everybody is there for the team, not just for themselves. So
recognizing people's strengths. And using the strengths of the team is important. I mean, not everybody can be part of every single decision that needs to happen, and that's okay. And people need to be able to put their hands up and say, hey, it's not my expertise, I'm not going to be in that. But you described it absolutely right. You just get everybody kind of on the same page, but having their own little experience at the same time, because it can't always just be about the best for the group. I mean, it's got to be, as the individual enjoying themselves as well. And if they're happy and they're content and they're learning, then they're going to be a real super team member anyways, aren't they?
Yeah. And, you mentioned a little bit about, not everybody is involved in every decision. And, in business expedition environment, there is a time for consensus when we can all sit around and talk about it. And there's a time when one of us just needs to make a call. And that's where you have to have the team that is willing to support and buy into the decision, even if they weren't the one who made that decision.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing worse than stalling on trying to make decisions, and just being able to make a decision maybe isn't always the right decision. Who knows what the right decision is, but to be able to move on making a decision is an important element.
So in the polar training courses that you run, are you mostly training individuals, or do you have teams? Do you talk about team dynamics within any of that?
Yeah, there's a mix of things. There's more so big groups, I'd say, or groups of sort of 4 to 6. And it's an interesting point. I don't know if we would discuss team dynamics as such, and it would be fascinating to do that, as we used to do with a lot of our Outward Bound courses. But we definitely spent a lot of time teaching, those basics and understanding those are the building blocks. So it's sort of a quiet way to do that. But it would be fascinating to talk about But I mean, because it's a team that we might be training to work individually with other teams. It's not so much about building that particular team. And so that would be a different kind of training. One time we had a group from the Joint Military Forces for New Zealand and Australia, and they were a team that were training together in Norway, then to go do a South Pole expedition. So that was a different focus, and it would be focusing more on what you're talking about recognizing team dynamics and within that, whereas a lot of the other training courses would be individuals who come on their own to join a group and then move on to their own trips.
Yeah. So we've talked a bunch about the North Pole trip, but can you tell us about another trip where you've been, part of a team in an extreme environment? It can be anywhere. It could have been Australia. It could have been Antarctica. But how did teamwork really make the difference between success and failure on an expedition like that?
Yeah, a couple of I've a Greenland crossing. I've only done the Greenland crossing once, to be honest, and it was in a really special role of mentoring a young woman who is now slightly older, and now she's skiing solo to the South Pole. So we had an amazing experience together, but we also had an incredible storm. So there was about 6 of us on that expedition, and we got stuck in, it wasn't katabatic winds because they were earlier in the season, but it was a 3-day serious storm. So we hunkered down, and thankfully we knew it was coming, and we prepared ourselves, and we basically were patient and patiently waited it out. So that was a very extreme situation to be in. And I really don't like wind to begin with. And that was something I never want to experience again. There was other teams out there, and one of the, I won't say the leaders of the team, but one of their tents got blown away and somebody got stuck in a tent, and there was all sorts of horrific stuff that can happen out there. But thankfully we were prepared. And so in work, there was a funny, and not funny, it's funny when I think about it now, but so running around the Australian outback trying to chase this rogue camel away from our camels, this sort of young buck decided he needed to come in and try to steal our female camels. We had about 16 camels on our trips, and we didn't ride them. They were just carrying our gear, and we would walk and travel miles and miles over the sand dunes. But we decided that, we did carry a shotgun, and but you don't want to have to use a shotgun if it's not necessary. So we spent hours, honestly, hours, clanging pots together and banging sticks and shouting and blowing whistles to try to keep this crazy, wild sort of buck out of our camp, to keep away from our camels. And it was so amazing to sort of, everybody had to get up in the middle of the night, and like run around in circles and keep this crazy camel out. So after he decided that we won, basically, and he left us alone, it was just the most amazing sort of breakfast, because we were up all night and we were just so thrilled that we'd, protected our tribe, basically. It was really quite interesting. So that was an example of really coming together as in a really unusual situation with a bunch of people. One of the South Pole expeditions, one of the first ones I guided, and it was with Hannah on that trip, and another fellow named Craig Matheson, who runs the Polar Academy, which is a fantastic charity. We had a crazy beginning of the trip. We had a tent blow away. Then we all got stuck in the tent, because the one tent we had left, with a storm. And then another group had to join our group, and then one of our team members of the original left. So we had all these sort of very disruptive things happening in the first 26 days of our expedition, and it was just like, what's going to happen next? And eventually it all just settled down, and we all started to perform really well and enjoy ourselves. And we had the most incredibly fun trip that I've had. Never have I ever mirrored that trip. We laughed basically from Thiel's Mountain to the South Pole. Very extreme, you know what it's like. It's like big steep climbs, and it's windy all the time and very cold on the plateau. But we just had the time of our lives. I think it's because we got rid of all the sort of things and the people that didn't want to be there, and it was just the ones who were really committed to the trip that stayed in the end, and we just had a fantastic time.
Yeah, so it's a great segue, because I want to talk about next is change, because change is a big topic in the leadership environment, right? Because as leaders, we are often the ones who initiate change, but then we also have to help people through that, and then sometimes sometimes we as the leaders initiate it, but sometimes it just happens. Like there's
Mhm.
nothing, we didn't even see it coming, and boom, it's there. So when dramatic change occurs, how do you as a leader, how do you think you need to process it first? And then what's the best way to share it with the team? That something has completely pulled the rug out from under you or turned to 180 degrees. How do you process it? And then how do you share it?
Well, there was I can think of a few different examples. So a change that happened, like losing that tent, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, I could have lost the plot because they never should have left the tent. And we know what happened, and they pulled out the plug, they pulled out the peg, and it wasn't attached to the bulk, and the tent just went screaming towards Hercules Inlet. And you're like, we ran after it, and it was sort of all a bit sort of dramatic. And then at one point, I just stopped, and I think I looked at Hannah and I said, "Let's go make tea and just set up the other tent and think about this." So we chilled out, and I sort of needed to diffuse. And for me as the leader, I probably needed that time to set up the tent and get the stove going and make a cup of tea and just sort of think about how I wanted to handle that, because like it shouldn't have happened, and I felt stupid as the leader that it did happen because my people should have been more trained. But you can't just sort of hold their hand the whole time. And so eventually we started talking about that. And I just sort of said, I was disappointing to me that it happened, and it was a serious safety issue now. And, how are we going to get better? How are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? So thankfully, I didn't lose the plot, and I, was patiently and quietly thinking about how to identify the things that had gone wrong. And they did get better after that a little bit. I'd say, we pulled it together, and we got stuck in the tent for 3 days anyway. So we had a lot of time to talk about it. So, but change that happens with individuals, you're right. I mean, we all put ourselves, change is constant. And it's, for me, I think I'm actually slightly addicted to change. I like new things. I like to sort of to be pressed. I like to sort of feel a bit out there. And I'm sure a lot of people come on the trips that we lead for those experiences, and some of them are prepared for those waves of change and sort of emotions that come up, and some aren't. And I think it just takes a real skill to be able to read what the person needs. Do they need comforting? Do they need to just internalize it themselves? Do we need to talk about it? How pressing do we be? I think in my younger years, when I was working at Outward Bound, I probably would have thought everything needed to get talked about and brought up, and it was all really important. Everything was really serious. You need to look at stuff. And I think now I would say sometimes just quietly skiing beside somebody and checking in. If it's a real positive, you got to let them be real positive and encourage all that and share that sort of enthusiasm that they have, this whole newfound thing, and let them explore it. I don't think there's a right answer to this question, because it's going to be so different with each different situation and each different person. But I suppose as a leader, to be aware that it's happening is a really important skill to have. It's being, keeping in touch with the group dynamics and the individuals on the team and what they need. And, we're just people too as leaders. And, some things I've been faced with, when one of the trips at Outward Bound, one of the young people, talked about a sexual assault as a young person. And that was just something that was not within my ability to deal with. Thankfully, the person I worked with had the skills to kind of deal with that sort of expression of that of their experience. But there's stuff that comes out that I will never be prepared to deal with. And other times I feel like I've lived enough and had enough of my own stuff going on that I can kind of understand what people are going through. So I'm kind of waffled on about that question. What would you say to that? How would you answer that?
Well, I think a lot of what you're talking about is maturity as a leader and maturity as a person, understanding, that different people need different things, and they might need something different than what you would need in that same situation.
Mm-hmm.
And how can you be intuitive enough or connected enough with people to know, as you say, when do you talk? When do you just ski silently beside them? When do you ask questions? Where do you share a story? It's having that maturity as an individual and as a leader to help different people, because that's a big part of our job as a leader, is to help people to navigate change. And so first of all, if we're going to navigate change, I personally, I got to have my shit together. I got to process it myself, right? Go and set up the tent, have some tea, reflect upon this, and then I can then, once I get myself together and figure out, how can I best deal with the situation? So now how can I go and help others through this as well? And, I think that's a big part of leadership, because in these expeditions, change is always happening, and different people will respond to it differently. And how can you, as that servant leader, again, help those individuals to get the most out of the expedition?
Yeah, definitely. And on our North Pole trip, I mentioned earlier about falling through the ice. Well, it was a very serious situation where three of us actually went down the ice. It wasn't one of those things you see in the cartoon where it cracks and you fall in and everybody splash. It was like oatmeal, just sort of everything just falling to pieces and sinking down. And it was a really serious situation, very serious. And that was the kind of situation that just needed some pretty direct leadership.
Yeah. Oh, Mike, we've frozen here for a second, Denise. I don't know if you can hear me anymore, but hopefully we come back online in a moment here. We can just sit silently and contemplate. And hopefully it starts up again in a second here. Maybe we'll try to edit this out once we're done. Okay, we are back. We had a little technological glitch there. We lost Denise, but we're back, and Denise was just telling us about falling through the ice in the North Pole.
Yeah, no kidding. So three of us fell into the ice, just like oatmeal sort of falling amongst us. And it's just a good example of a time when, as a leader, I actually needed to be quite decisive. And as one of the people that was swimming and in the ice, it was also quite a bit of a thing to be wearing both hats, I guess you could say. And so I was quite directive to the other two women who fell in, and they thankfully could get up on some big chunks of ice. And myself, I ended up swimming with my skis on to get onto some more secure ice. Eventually, the two women on the ice chunks got pulled out by rope from a throw bag from Matty onto one side of the lead, but I was on the other side, drenched up to my ears. I remember thinking, I wasn't the least bit cold. I just had so much adrenaline, but there was all this equipment floating around. There were 3 sleds full of radio equipment, stoves, tents, and all the a lot of survival stuff that we needed for the expedition to continue. So I made a very quick and hard decision to put my skis back on and ski out over the stuff that I just swam through. And thankfully had my brain engaged enough to get myself on belay with just the extra ropes that we had. So I had the 2 women that were with me tie a rope around my waist with the carabiner, and they sort of paid out the rope as I skied out. And I think it was a brave move on my part, because the expedition would have basically come to an end. We would probably, we didn't have a tent. The tent was out there floating, and we all would have been sitting in our the couple of sleds that we had and a couple of sleeping bags, and no way to communicate to anybody. We had the Argos and the HF radio were all floating out in the ice. So it was one of those decisions where actually it was just me making it. And as the leader, I knew that was what needed to happen. And so we spent, I know I'm going on about this, because we then went into the tent eventually when everybody got back together, and spent a lot of time debriefing and reviewing how we were traveling and reviewing how we were carrying our equipment, and realizing that we had it all wrong. Like, you don't put all the stoves in one place, and we had one tent, and we should have been carrying the radio and any survival stuff on our backs or something. So we really rejigged the trip to make it a safer experience. And that was a really important thing to do after such an incredibly brutal safety scare, really.
Yeah. When again, going back to the whole tenets of Outward Bound and experiential learning, right? That's where we learn quickly when, in crisis. We learn
Yes,
what we've done right, and we learn what
I
we've
know we don't know yet.
and hopefully we can you know be smart enough to take those learnings from that experience and apply them so that we can continue to be more successful as we go on. Last topic is just about resilience, and again, I think your story about falling through the ice in the North Pole is a great example of resilience. That's something that you could, it could just end the expedition at that point, and you're like, I've had enough. We all get into these situations in our personal lives. We have them all the time in the expedition environment, and we have these tough times when you just think, can I keep going, or do I want to keep going? And the mental part is so important. So how is it that how do you think you have developed your personal resilience over the years?
Well, I think being the youngest of 4 girls was the start of it.
Yeah.
Definitely. My mom still tells stories of me, at the back gate where my sisters were all going to school, and I was like, "Let me out! I need to go to school. I need to be with them." So I spent my childhood just trying to keep up with my bigger sisters, and so that I think that was just part of my DNA. I think, to be honest, and I think, I was never really afraid to just sort of not step it up a bit. I'm a very conservative outdoor person and a conservative leader, but I also like to take the next step up. And I think one of the skills of being a good leader or guide or instructor is recognizing when somebody can just be slightly pushed a little bit, but not too much, because you don't want to push somebody where they get freaked out and they don't want to do it again. And so I suppose for me, I was kind of always doing that. I would do whitewater or flat water canoe trips. Then I was doing whitewater canoe trips. Then I was flying in and doing whitewater canoe trips. Okay, so just sort of constantly building my comfort zone and my level. And I guess I'm just I wouldn't say I'm overly confident, but I'm pretty content within myself and feel like I can try new things and do new things. And I mess up all the time, and like, it's not a big deal. I'm okay with getting things wrong, and I'm okay to say, "Oh, that was a stupid idea." But I was speaking with my sister, one of my sisters, the other day. I was with my sister Leanne, and I said, I've always been this kind of person who needs to try things on. Like, I couldn't just buy something and not know how it worked. If I was going to move somewhere, I'd have to go to that place and see what it was like. I just need to keep trying things to see how they fit, physically, emotionally, mentally. And I guess that's just a way of building my resilience, I'd say, and my ability to take on new things and know that it's okay to not be great at it, but just try and then build. Like, does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, and you mentioned the term comfort zone, which so often this all takes us back to our Outward Bound foundation, because that was a big topic of conversation many times in Outward Bound circles. Looking at the comfort zone, but then what you're talking about is stepping outside the comfort zone into that learning zone, but not going so far that you enter into the panic zone where we're not learning anymore, but spending as much time in that learning zone. And then that's where we build resilience, as you say, to next time you go a little bit higher, a little bit further, a little bit deeper, whatever it is. And if you keep exposing yourself into that learning zone, you're learning, but then you're also increasing your resilience to be able to work effectively in these extreme environments. Whether it's at high altitude or whether it's in a polar storm, you need to have that resilience to be able to act effectively even when the world is falling apart around you.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation, Scott. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's like this sort of these circles that sort of you're in, and I do really fully believe that as a leader, you need to be able to read the individuals and where they are in that zone, and then what's going to allow them to grow out from that. And you hope that they're willing to be in that learning role. And I do think another way to continue to develop resilience is to constantly be a learner. Like, for us to be putting ourselves in new situations so that we understand what it's like to be somebody learning something new, but also for us to sort of go, oh, hey, it's humbling and it's builds new skills. So I think being a constant learner and knowing that we all have stuff to learn all the time is really important.
Yeah. So before we wrap things up, I just wanted to see, do you have one more story? You got lots of great stories. Do you have one more story for us about a favorite team experience? What made it so great?
Yeah, there's so many, and you think, oh yeah, they're always the little silly ones where you just sort of do silly stuff. The North Pole trip was exceptional and an experience that I would never do again. So many great outward bound courses, so many freezing cold winters, sleeping in dog sleds and doing mental things. The sort of that South Pole trip that I mentioned, my very first South Pole trip it's one that's exceptional in my mind because it was just so much fun. And I think it always reminds me that it's important to have fun on trips. And the fun isn't just like, being silly, but fun is like being open and joyful and positive. And those things are just really important. And I forget them because I can get quite serious, especially in my younger days of guiding. I was like very serious and everything was very serious and, things needed to be done a certain way. And I think just having that lightheartedness and a genuine approach to things is a good reminder for me. So that South Pole trip with, like I said, with Craig and Hannah. I've done some other really great Norway trips. One recently with Ari Johansson and the team. It was just one of those magical groups where everything came together in the most magical weather, in the most beautiful environment. And those things it doesn't always happen that way. It doesn't always gel. It's like when people think they're going to go dog sledding and the whole time is about, the wind rushing through their hair and it's always sunny and beautiful. And it's like 25% of the time, it might be that way. The rest of the time, the dogs are driving you crazy or you're falling off the sled and things like that. So yeah, actually thinking about, I did a piece with Lonely Planet up in Baffin Island. And I was with this guy, Ian Wright. He was just the funniest guy. God, he made me laugh. But I was supposed to be this big time musher and I was supposed to know what I was doing. And I sort of did most of the time, but I actually fell off the dog sled as they were filming and swore as I'm running after the dogs trying to catch up to them. So that actually didn't get edited, which I thought was even funnier. So yeah, that's a funny story. Like, you keep thinking of these things. Like I was saying earlier when I was speaking to Leanne about the time we did that trip together on Black Sturgeon Lake at -40, like who goes out in -40?
Yeah. Yeah. When, I like the, just talking about the fun as being so important because, there's been all kinds of research studies that have shown that when teams are having fun together, they're much more resilient. They can deal with change more effectively. They're just better mentally. Their physical abilities are stronger. Just when you're having fun, you're a positive environment, everything else is better. You're more creative. You're all kinds of stuff comes out of it. So I think that's a great place to wrap up our conversation today. So thanks, Denise. It's been great chatting with you. So many great fun stories and just the way you can articulate and share your thoughts and experiences with people, I think was very valuable. And I hope people who watch this really enjoy this and take a lot from it. So thanks for spending a little bit of time with us today and sharing your stories and thoughts and insights. And I do hope that we get out to share some further adventures, Northern Canada, Norway, somewhere in the near future. So thanks again, Denise, and hopefully we'll maybe even have you back on here again and share some more stories.
That would be great. Thanks for your time. I really, really have enjoyed it, Scott. So have a great rest of the day, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Denise. Okay, I'm going to stop recording, and you might get kicked out.
Okay.
If you do get kicked out, maybe just pop back in for a second.
Okay.